I guess we should come to the details of your arrest.
Ununiformed police, armed police, and they just sort of stream into the house. I mean, they say you're under arrest under the Terrorism Act.
Let's move to the tragic events of last week, of course.
Any violence of that sort on anyone, but on innocent civilians, is horrific. And it is certainly not the mandate of any protest that are trying to break the cycle of violence.
Well, what are your thoughts on Trump's peace plan?
I guess there is also a political reality that the only person on this planet right now who possibly has the power to rein in the Israeli government is Trump.
Tim Crosland, thank you for joining me in the studio for the second time. People probably won't remember this because it was a little while ago, but we actually spoke late last year around the time of the crime and policing bill, I believe, and also before the mass trial in January.
Yes, the mass appeal.
Yeah, the mass appeal. So this is going to be a little bit of a callback, but I think I initially opened the interview last year by asking you what the state of protest rights in the UK was. And I suppose what I'm asking you is, where do you think we are relative to last year in that same vein?
Yeah, well, because we thought it was bad then.
Yeah, I suppose that's, this is what...
I think I remember how we started, because yes, we'd been talking about the mass jailing of people for peaceful protests, which was the summer of 24. And I kind of remember going back to some of the issues from, a decade previously, where peaceful protesters had been jailed in Russia for 2 years. Pussy Riot, for example, the young women there. And the outrage coming from the then conservative government, or the supposed outrage at this violation of democratic norms that was presented as, Putin's complete rejection of the West and descent into authoritarianism. And yet, last summer, we were doing precisely the same thing and worse, jailing peaceful protesters for 4 and 5 years. So that's where we were last summer. And I guess it's kind of almost nostalgic for those, those good times now, relative good times. Because part of the context and part of what I think we're here to discuss is a move where people silently, quietly, protesting in Parliament Square against the genocide, but also against the extension of terrorism legislation beyond its proper remit, are being swept up into police vans and charged with Terrorism Act offences. And now we really are, that is full on from the playbook of authoritarianism. Treat your political opponents who are embarrassing power, embarrassing the government, because I think it's clear that that's what's happening. Treat them as terrorists denied all democratic rights. So in a nutshell, I'd say that's a reflection on where we've come since last summer.
Since we last spoke, so many things have happened, among which was the prescription of Palestine Action by Yvette Cooper. And I wonder, first off, I'd like to talk about maybe your initial reaction to sort of that news breaking, but also why is this the natural conclusion of the trends we were seeing last year?
I think it is, yes. And it's also worth pointing out quite quickly, I think, that the first sort of public call to ban Palestine Action came from Lord Wolney in May 2024. It was also, the headlines were also about banning Just Stop Oil. That was the initial headline for his report. And it was in the months following that report, in May 24, that we see that mass jailing of peaceful protesters. So in that sense, yes, it's just almost like the completion of Lord Walney's programme. Despite Lord Walney having been sacked in February of this year, following a campaign which many different people had a part in, including, I would say, Byline Times. I mean, excellent journalism from Byline Times, exposing the conflicts of interest, the very sort of patent, blatant, shameless conflicts of interest of somebody being presented to the public as an independent advisor on political violence and disruption, who is in fact being paid by the oil industry and the arms industry, and was previously chair of Labour Friends of Israel. I mean, most reasonable people would say, well, that is not independent when the recommendations that you are making benefit precisely those constituencies and the companies who are paying you. I mean, that's not independent on any, sane understanding of independence.
No, it certainly isn't.
But yet the things he recommended have come to pass. And despite his removal from office, he's still presented in the media as the arch sort of sponsor of the prescription. He's the one person who can be reliably wheeled out to defend the prescription when everybody else is saying, well, really, this seems like a bit of a political disaster for the government, including Labour MPs and including Labour Party members and including the Trade Union Congress and their 5.5 million workers. But Lord Walney's still there going, what an excellent move this was that I recommended. So in that sense, yes, it is just the playing out of the recommendations from the oil and arms industry lobbyists. That's what we're seeing. And that's not democracy. No. It's a sort of corporate authoritarianism.
I suppose you've almost answered it there, but so in your mind, it's motivated by corporate interest, self-interest.
Yes. And I hope it's not just in my mind. I think there's quite a lot of objective evidence of this. Freedom of Information Act requests that reveal a series of meetings between Elbit Systems. So this is without the mediation of lobbyists. This is direct. The CEO of Elbit Systems meeting, I think it's first Priti Patel in 2022, then Chris Philp in 2023. Most of the minutes of those meetings are black, as in they've been redacted. And it's interesting the bits that remain visible. And it's, for example, the permanent secretary saying to the minister, the purpose of this meeting is to reassure Elbit Systems that we take their concerns about Palestine action seriously. Then blacked out. And then there'll be a section which says, although there have been prosecutions of Palestine action, many times they have resulted in acquittals, either from magistrates or juries. Then blacked out. The acquittal of Palestine action by juries who are randomly selected members of the public being seen as a problem to be addressed. So there you've got evidence of the direct lobbying from Elbit Systems itself. And then you've got interesting sort of additional factors around this picture, which is, I believe, the first time prescription is sort of formally put on to the table, not publicly, but in Whitehall, is the day after Elbit has got down to the last two for the tender of a huge contract to train the British military. I think it's a £2 billion contract. And I might get these dates slightly wrong, but I believe it's the 10th of February of this year that Elbit get to the last two, and then the 11th of February that the prescription plan is mooted. So you don't need a huge amount of imagination to put those factors together and see where the pressure has been coming from for a move that even Whitehall considered novel and unprecedented, extending terrorism laws beyond groups that advocate for violence. And even within those Whitehall assessments, you will have JTAC, the Joint Terrorist Assessment Centre, saying there is a danger with this move. This will be perceived as the extension of Lord Walney's programme, amid public commentary about Lord Walney's conflicts of interest. But yes, I don't think it's right to put it all on Lord Walney. I think Lord Walney is a sort of figurehead for this.
Emblematic of a wider problem.
But exactly.
What would you say to someone who turns around to you and says, the prescription of Palestine action was directly the result of the RAF base in Cyprus being broken into, the desecration of a plane? In many ways, Keir Starmer and the Labour government's hands were tied. What would you say to someone who turns around and says that to you?
Well, I think the first thing is to acknowledge that clearly played a role in it, because it's on the same Friday of that incident that the plan to prescribe is announced. So again, I don't think there's any serious doubt that was a significant factor. And then let's just sort of summarise what that is. The spray painting of RAF planes red in circumstances where there is very substantial evidence of RAF flights on a daily basis over Gaza, while, roughly the government is telling the British public that they share the public's horror at what is happening in Gaza and the violations of law that are occurring and the spectacle of starving people queuing for food, being shot, and all the other horrific things. So if the traditional democratic purpose of protest is to highlight things that it's proper for the public to know about, that their money, taxpayer money, is going to supporting something that the public as a whole does not support, that the public as a whole is horrified by, because ordinary people are horrified by those scenes. Well, what I would say is that is an example of why protest is so valuable in democracy, why it's so vital, because it captures people's attention in a way that the detailed written reports just do not, which pre-existed that action. It's not that there was no information available to the public about those flights. It's just that it's quite densely written and not very accessible. And then I think the other major point to make is, yes, this is part of a proud British tradition. I mean, people don't talk about the Greenham women as terrorists. Maybe not everybody agrees with what happened at Greenham Common, and that's fine, because we live in a democracy where people should be, people do have different views about things. But they were cutting holes in the wire at RAF Greenham Common. That was what it was about, the US military base. It's, that's part of our tradition. Naturally, it's something that conscientious people protest about, the use of arms to slaughter people. And there can be arguments on both sides, but it has always been a site of protest, military bases, whether it's, Greenham, whether it's in the context of the war in Iraq and the people that Keir Starmer defended around, precisely the same thing as in direct action on military planes. So, I would say just please check out your history. Please check out your history of democracy in this country before saying that the natural consequence of spray painting planes red should be prescription as terrorists, because it seems to be completely blind to our democratic history.
And what about the political fallout of maybe not doing anything? Do you think it would be feeding parties like Reform, the Conservative Party? What do you think?
I actually don't believe even that, because I didn't see anybody else calling for the prescription. It's not as though Reform were calling for Palestine action to be prescribed. It's not as though the Conservative government was calling for Palestine action to be prescribed. It's not as though there is nothing you can do about it. I mean, people are being prosecuted. One of the things we talked about last time we spoke was the fact that, a large group of young people, it's now the Filton, well, not only young people, and I don't want to mischaracterize it, but a lot of people had taken principled action because of the British government's violation of international law, being held on remand for extraordinary lengths of time prior to trial. They're still on remand now, awaiting trial. Yes, that was without the prescription. So no, I don't think it occurred to anybody that there was an issue here that couldn't be addressed through the ordinary criminal law. We were seeing the expansion of the criminal law to sort of jailing people in a way we hadn't seen before. And that was already, causing concern across civil society. Yeah. So no, I don't think the pressure was coming from anywhere other than industry and the Israeli government.
Let's move to the tragic events of last week. Of course, I believe it was last Wednesday, there was a stabbing attack at a Manchester synagogue. Since then, we were speaking about this before, but I think something has been activated, certainly in certain sectors of the media. I suppose what I'm asking is, why do you think we are seeing such a hostile attitude levied towards protests on the issue of Palestine, especially in light of the attack last week?
I think the first thing to say is that the attacks are horrific. Any violence of that sort on anyone, but on innocent civilians, is horrific. And it is certainly not the mandate of any protest that are trying to break the cycle of violence and grounded in non-violence. And I think what we see and what we're seeing right across society is a politics of fear. And I don't question for a minute that there are sections of the Jewish community in Britain who are deeply fearful and witnessing things that make them more fearful, just as it seems obvious that there must be many in the Muslim community seeing Unite the Kingdom marches who must be deeply fearful. There must be many immigrants in this country listening to rhetoric about, mass deportations who must be deeply fearful. And through all that fear, and through politicians, demagogues trading on that fear, because fear is a powerful emotion. Again, we've seen it through history. Then I think it's not surprising that it is used to divide and rule. And I do think that's partly what was happening over the weekend. Different groups in mourning for different reasons, but related reasons, all grounded in, a destabilizing time, being pitted against each other, as if horror at the slaughter in Gaza is incompatible with horror at the slaughter in Manchester, as opposed to stemming from a shared concern for the, sacredness of life, of human life. It's just completely wrong to pit them against each other, but not surprising. But I think it is, amidst all that fear, it's good to be analytical. And it's good to just put under a bit of scrutiny some of the arguments that were advanced for postponing the Saturday protest. So I'd like to do that, if that's okay.
Of course,
I think there were two primary arguments being advanced by the Met and then by Starmer. And the first was that what you are doing, defend our juries. I'm going to talk specifically about defend our juries, although I'm not, organising that at the moment because of my bail conditions. So I'm really talking as an observer here.
And we'll get into that later.
We'll come to that later, yes. But what you are doing is you are distracting police resources away from the Jewish community at a time of real threat to life. And real terrorism. And I think that's quite an interesting argument, but let's just come back to that in a second. And the second line of argument, and you saw Rowley sort of articulate this, was that the protests themselves are somehow, or possibly, maybe, inherently anti-Semitic, and themselves, generating violence against the Jewish population, or capable of doing that, and sparking animosity against the Jewish population. So those are the two arguments that were advanced. And I think if there'd been any substance to either of them, then people would have thought seriously about postponing the protest. But there is no substance to either of those arguments. And the first one is interesting, isn't it, in a way, because they're sort of leaning into our position. They're leaning into our position of saying, you are taking resources away from real terrorism. You're diverting counter-terrorism officers from where they need to be. Well, hang on a second. Let's have a think about that. Who's responsible for that? Who made activity that is obviously not terrorist, supposedly terrorist? Who brought in or purported to bring in legislation that means that people holding cardboard signs against the genocide, against the improper extension of terrorism legislation, are being treated as terrorists? And then the idea that the police have no choice, which again was inherent in sort of the Met Commissioner's communications, the fiction of that has been exposed by seeing his colleagues in different bits of the country, from Totnes to Derry, from Kendal to Edinburgh, policing exactly the same protests, the same law, and deciding that no, arrests were not necessary. So it was a political choice for the Met Police to carry on doing what everybody can see is crazy and everybody can see is disproportionate. There is no obligation to arrest in circumstances where, A, the law is completely ambiguous and uncertain, and B, everyone can see there is no threat to the public at all. The second argument, that the protests are anti-Semitic, Inherently. Yeah. That to me is how can it be anti-Semitic to protest against genocide?
I do think you'll have bad apples everywhere. And I think that's less indicative of the whole thing and more anomalous in my mind.
People can say you have large crowds building, some may come along from different places, different sources, all kinds of things can be said for sure. But inherently, the protests are deeply peaceful. The organisation encourages everybody who takes part to participate in non-violence training. The purpose of non-violence training being to help people to find a way to navigate the polarisation in society, not to react, not to allow provocation to get to you. But the other thing, one of the tragic ironies in this whole situation is that the freedoms we're seeking to defend here, in particular, democratic rights under the European Convention of Human Rights, they come in the aftermath of the Holocaust. That's when the European Convention on Human Rights is negotiated and agreed. Never again. How do we make sure that demagoguery and the politics of fear never allows us again to get into a situation where we are standing by and watching as a population is being massacred. And so, to my mind, as somebody of Jewish heritage myself, my maternal grandmother was a German Jew who gets out just in time. And we talk a lot about, the role of the bystander. It would be to dishonor all of that history and all of that legacy, which is ultimately, it's a Jewish legacy, to watch what's happening in Gaza and to be silent about it. And that is why we have so many, or one of the reasons we have many, many Jewish groups, many Jewish people involved in these actions. So this anti-Semitism slur is just wrong. But then there's the secondary point about a role of the protests in sparking anger against the Jewish community and others. So that's a slightly more nuanced argument. It's, okay, we accept, your intention is peaceful, but you cannot be so naive as not to see that these protests are going to make other less responsible people angry. Going back to the so-called war on terror and hundreds of thousands of civilians being slaughtered in Iraq. And at the time, I'm working for the government. I'm a government lawyer. And I do remember reading intelligence assessments at the time saying, we're wary that one of the consequences of this is going to be an increase in terrorist activity because images and film of the suffering of Muslim people in Iraq and elsewhere is being circulated, and that is fanning the flames for Islamic extremism. This is all in inverted commas, and it's my summary of what I remember reading, the intelligence assessments being. Now, nobody suggested at the time that what was fanning the flames of, let's call it for the sake of argument, the terrorism that hits the UK and other places in the aftermath of that. I don't remember anybody saying the cause of it was the marches against the wars. What's sparking there, the anger and hostility against Britain and the US, according to those assessments, is the images of the slaughter and suffering of Muslims. Not people saying that the slaughter and suffering should stop. So it feels very far-fetched to me for anyone to say that the anti-Semitism, and I fully believe and fully accept there is a rising level of anti-Semitism in this country, as there is rising levels of Islamophobia. We're seeing this. It's no doubt about that. But if someone wants to say, well, the cause of that is not the images that people are viewing on a daily basis of the horrific things happening in Gaza, but it's the protests against that? Well, where is your evidence for that? It's a very counterintuitive proposition. And if you understand that actually it's these, it's the horrific wars that are ongoing that is driving the polarization, well, then the proper response from all sides is to do what we can to stop it and to stop British complicity. Because then you tackle the causes of polarization on all sides, the causes of fear on all sides. So, in fact, I don't accept the characterization of the Defend Our Jury's protests as pro-Palestine protests or even pro-Palestine action protests. No, fundamentally, they're about the democratic rights that prevent this kind of polarization and this kind of violence, that hold us together as a society. And that was always the intention of those democratic norms and freedoms. So it is the divide and rule politics of others that presents it in that false way.
So, I mean, you've given your analysis, which I suppose is one way of answering the next question. So I'll adjust it slightly. In light of that polarization, well, what do you say to the bereaved Jewish British citizen who says to you, I don't think you should be protesting right now? How do you bridge that gap in light of the polarization you speak of?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because this isn't all rational, is it? I mean, I guess the first part of my answer to you was quite a sort of rational analysis of those arguments, and it isn't all rational. When people are grieving, it doesn't feel rational. Be like telling somebody at a funeral, you will get over it, right? It's not the right thing to say, is it? But right now, there are a lot of people feeling grief for a lot of reasons, and a lot of people feeling fear. And I'm going to come directly to your question in a second.
Please.
But let's also remember, at an emotional level, I think was it another 60 Palestinians killed in Gaza on Saturday night when, allegedly a ceasefire. Think about the grief about that, the grief of the people who are still starving. There was an arson attack on a mosque in Sussex on Saturday that, barely made any headlines.
Yeah.
By the fear,
yeah, you're right, yeah.
Communities around that. If we get into a place where whenever there is grief, whenever there is fear, at a time where there is so much of both of those things, and that becomes a reason to stop doing the thing that aims to address that polarization, then what we end up in is a lack of agency. We end up with people doing nothing for fear that they're going to offend somebody, and that feeds the conditions of fascism and authoritarianism that is driving all of this. Not saying those would be the words for someone in grief, but I think the words would be, please join us, because we've got to come together. We've got to come together if we're going to address the causes of this polarization. And allowing politicians to play this game of divide and rule and pitting us against each other, all of this as human beings together, not as Jews, not as Palestinians, as human beings. Let's come together against all of this. We must break the cycle of violence. And what better way to do that than to sit quietly together, opposed to violence, and that activity, that solidarity with each other, Jews coming together with Muslims, with Christians, with people of pagans, no faith at all, whatever, but just standing together against things which we know as human beings are wrong. It's one of the ways we can begin to process the grief that we feel in these times, and also see our collective power. When what we're opposed to is the interests of corporate elites who've learnt how to generate profits out of any crisis, let no good crisis go to waste, take every moment of fear as an opportunity to remove further those democratic rights that potentially compromise their profiteering. So first of all, understand what it is that is driving this. Secondly, we must come together against it.
I guess we should come to the details of your arrest. I know obviously you can't talk about the details of the charges against you, but whatever you can reveal, could you just talk about your experience?
Yes. I mean, it is a slightly surreal situation to be in, where you're fundamentally there's a campaign about free speech, and it feels not very easy to talk about it. I mean, there's an irony there for a start, isn't there? You can't talk about your free speech campaign. So I mean, I'm able to talk about my understanding anyway. This is my genuine understanding, and I've got a legal background, so I can talk about the process of the arrests on the 2nd of September. So this is the Tuesday before the action on the 6th of September in Parliament Square. And we had seen previously a sort of escalation of law enforcement activity just before a protest, as if its real purpose was to disrupt, deter, rather than uphold the law. So anyway, on the 2nd of September, actually on the 1st of September, on the Monday, a friend of mine had lost their key, came to borrow a spare key. I said, please bring it back, because, you're always losing your key. We need to have the spare key here. And then the doorbell rings at 7 on a Tuesday. And because of that, I just think, oh, it's going to be them with the key, because I know they get up early, and now they know I get up early. But anyway, I open the door. It's not them. It's a stream. I mean, it looks like a never-ending stream of ununiformed police, armed police. And they just sort of stream into the house. I mean, they say you're under arrest under the Terrorism Act, Section 12. My recollection is that, I mean, I'm cautioned. I remember sort of talking quite a lot and saying, this is crazy. What's happening here? And the lead officer says, I think you should stay quiet. I'm going, hang on, you're coming into my house. You might have a power to, I don't know, you haven't got a power to stop me talking. Where's your power to stop me talking? And my wife is there. It's her first day back at work after the summer holiday. My son is there. I think it's his second day back at school. They go streaming into their bedrooms. It's pretty bizarre, pretty full on.
Sounds like a very heavy-handed approach.
You could say that. Yeah. You could say that. And they're armed as well. And they start to search. Their main thing they're looking for is digital devices. So they take all my tech. They ask me for passwords. I don't give them passwords because you don't have to. Yeah. But they're using that moment of confusion to try to get you to do something that's very significant. Yeah. And if you do give those passwords up, you're exposing the data of lots of other people who haven't consented. Yeah. And then I'm driven off to, handcuffed, driven to a counter-terrorism police station detention centre in Hammersmith, kept there for 2 days and nights. It's a very bizarre place. You're not even allowed to see other prisoners in the corridor. Yeah. So you only see the guards. Weirdly, you were able. There's good dinners. You could order whatever takeaway you wanted, and they would bring Dad. And then produced at Westminster Magistrates Court on the Thursday, and the prosecution are seeking our remand into custody. I'm being told by the lawyers you should expect to be remanded, and at the very earliest, it might be weeks before you get out. I'm going, really? You really?
Oh, I can imagine this must be all very, very frightening.
Because ultimately, I mean, although I can talk about what's been said in open court and what's been reported, the basis of it is the completely public and open calls on Zoom preliminary to the protests. That's what it is. And the charges are that being on those open public calls, I remember, because I'm on those calls, and I remember saying in my bit of it things like, is any police here, any journalists, you're very welcome, just to point out that what we're doing here is completely lawful, because it's about the improper extension of terrorism legislation. There's no law against that. And that on the basis of that, something very open, very democratic, subject to these extreme procedures, where what it feels like is, because that word terrorism is being used, all rational thought is removed. It's just, right, terrorism, this is what we do with allegations of terrorism. We're going to, get people into the detention centre. They're going to be subjected to extensive interviews where they're asked bizarre questions.
Cross-examined.
And then remanded and prevented from speaking to each other. Actually, we weren't remanded. We came out on tags and curfews, only able to use tech that had been approved by the police. But then if you couldn't, there was a sort of chicken and egg about that, because until your tech had been approved, how were you meant to speak to anybody to get it approved? And nobody really had an answer for that. Yes, so very bizarre Orwellian process. And I guess the good thing about it is, if the intention of the work of Defend Our Juries is to expose and to bring to public view the loss of democratic freedoms, and that trajectory that we talked about being on when we spoke last year, well, this demonstrates it in quite a visceral way. And we're now, due to be tried at the Old Bailey in the end of June of this year. So the Old Bailey, quite a significant site for Defend Our Juries. It's where that plaque is about jurors' rights according to their conscience. So on the one hand, it's wild and surreal, but on the other, well, it feels like something is coming to a moment. Yeah.
And has that been the experience for your fellow campaigners at Defend Our Juries?
I can't. It's very difficult for me to talk about the others. Okay. The others who were arrested on the same day, because we're not allowed to be in contact with each other. So it's another strange thing.
Do you know how many?
Yes, 5. Another 5.
And also, close to 500 arrests over the weekend as well.
Yeah.
Obviously not your, maybe not your colleagues, maybe some, but protesters, of course.
And over 2,000 now since the prescription came in.
Yeah.
So that people looking back on the statistics, because I think the average, number of arrests for terrorism in any year is normally 200. Well, we've got 10 times that in just a few months. So a statistician is going to go, oh my, what must have happened
staggering
in Britain in 2025?
Yeah.
Must have been something horrific.
Yeah. All right, well, I suppose my final question, just briefly, what are your thoughts on Trump's peace plan for Gaza? And perhaps the most ridiculous aspect of it is Tony Blair managing Gaza. What are your thoughts?
I mean, there are so many things about it that feel so wrong at so many levels. But then I guess there is also a political reality that the only person on this planet right now who possibly has the power to rein in the Israeli government and Netanyahu and the Israeli Defense Force is Trump. So you're asking me for my feelings. I feel torn between these two things. As you say, the idea of Tony Blair as a peacemaker in the Middle East with the legacy that he brings feels insulting. feels, politically, I don't know what the word is, it's extraordinary. Anybody could think that's the right person. But do I want to get into a position of saying, nothing about this feels, worth talking about, worth thinking about? I, like many people, want to see an end to the bombing, an end to the slaughter, an end to the famine. And I'm nervous about trashing something without seeing any alternative. So I feel there is some kind of responsibility, not to do that completely. While being pretty cynical and pretty skeptical. But I do feel that as long as Netanyahu feels he's got top cover from Trump, he will do what he wants to do, which is annihilate Gaza.
Amazing. Thank you, Tim.